Welcome to episode 102 of the Scottish Liberty Podcast with me, Anthony Sammeroff.
And me, the other guy.
Tom Laird. We have a special guest today, the illustrious Geoffrey Tucker, economics writer, author of many books, including It's a Jetsons World from a while ago, and I believe your most recent one is Right-Wing Collectivism. That's a collection of essays which I got on Amazon Kindle when it came out. How are you, Geoffrey?
Good. It's good to be here. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Pleasure's all ours.
Thank you for joining us. So I think a good thing to start with would be just a brief history of right-wing collectivism. What is it? Can we eat it?
Brief history. So my concern in writing the book is that I think that many libertarians have pretty well schooled in the problem of left socialism.
Right.
People who grew up in the Cold War, people who went to college, you're surrounded by left socialists all the time, and your professors we're force-fed this stuff from a very early age, and then we discern that there's something wrong with it, and we bail from it, and we ended up being sort of dissidents from that framework, and that's all great. The problem is that if you go back far enough in history to the early 19th century and the revolt against liberalism, it's always been the case that collectivism has taken on various forms. And left socialism is one of them, but there are two additional forms that are sort of extant that have this long history. One is right collectivism, which is tends to be more nationalistically oriented. It's not so much focused on collective ownership or nationalization of factories or power to the workers or something like that. Typically, right collectivism has different themes like nation based on language, geography, race, the people. So united and marching to a great leader, for example, is one of the normal themes you'd see in this. And a third theme, which I don't cover in the book, which is typically theocratic, actually.
Right.
And you can find these kind of highly politicized versions of religious doctrine in all the five main religious traditions: Catholicism, Protestantism, Islam, and Judaism, and occultism, which is basically what the Nazis really represented. So that's a third kind of revolt against liberalism. So, and what is liberalism? Liberalism is the conviction that society can work on its own without top-down authority, and that we're all better off if we just respect each other's rights and have freedom of speech and press and association and trade, and that this freedom should be equal for everybody. Everybody should have equal freedom, and that nobody should have privileges over anybody else. That's basically the liberal idea. But in the early 19th century, there was a big revolt against the social effects of this, which tend to be ennobling, of all of humanity, but leading people to move to the cities and build great enterprises and migrate to various places, and some people, the wrong people, get rich, and so that inspired a big revolt. And so what you saw developing through the 19th century, particularly on the continent, it took a little different form in the Anglo-Saxon world, but on the continent it took the form of left and right Hegelianism. Left Hegelianism became eventually, in the 20th century, communist theory. Well, actually, 19th century, late 19th century, communist theory, scientific socialism, but many other types of left socialism, including egalitarian Rousseauianism out of France and stuff like that. But then there was also this right Hegelian tradition that began with the celebration of protectionism, elevation of great men, the celebration of hierarchies, the demand to preserve slavery against the push to eliminate it, and build up the nation state as more powerful than the individual, and to limit the scope of individual action to defer to the national collective. And and of course it came to full fruition under Bismarck, but then later, with including the addition of scientific racism, restrictions on travel, the development of the corporate state and that sort of thing, and the military state, culminates then in the murderous and wacky experiment of Nazism, essentially. So my purpose in writing the book was to draw attention to this different flavor of collectivism, so that we understand that it's not just a random thing, that it has a deep history, and neither is it just motivated by like you get in Europe today. Anytime a nationalist movement rises up, the press will always say, "Oh, look, they're a bunch of racists." Well, to me, that's a very superficial. That may be true, but that's a very superficial way of looking at it. Essentially, this is a form of anti-liberalism that takes on various iterations in various countries in various ways. But the point is that it's not going to make us freer. It's trading one form of statism for another form of statism.
Do you have anything to add?
I have nothing to add to that.
Okay, great. Like, no, I really appreciate it. I think at this time it was a necessary part of the dialogue. I became a libertarian to the tail end of Bush, and for a period I felt more, well, being a person that came from the left, I felt that libertarian was more aligned with leftism at the time, because there was a revolt on the left against the war under Bush and against the surveillance state. But very quickly, it disappeared under Obama. And over that time, I've seen as libertarianism has grown as a force online and in the public mind, there has been a closer and closer connection, especially in the most recent years, with identifying with the right and the and they're seen as some kind of cross-pollination with the alt-right. Would you like to speak to that or comment on it?
Yeah. This is precisely why I wrote the book, was to alert people to the dangers of a different form of collectivism. I think that a lot of this grows out of a certain naivety among libertarians. So you get people showing up to your meetups and they're saying, "Oh, I hate the left. I hate the left. The terrible, the regressive left, and the way they're trying to manipulate us and control our speech and control our actions." And you're like, yeah. And then they start exploring other things. They're like, yeah, what about the nation? What about getting a great leader behind us? What about a race as a determinant factor in the sweep of history? And then they start going to strange places. And unfortunately, libertarians are weirdly naive about this, right? I mean, that's mostly what it comes down to, is that people are just unaware of it. I mean, I have friends of mine that for years said, "Oh, we should have freedom. As freedom's great." And it's like, "Oh, any exceptions?" No, freedom's great. And then they get under the influence of some guy who comes along and says, "Yeah, but I have a scientific theory about migration patterns, and if they take the wrong direction, then science tells us that the country is going to plunge into hell. And if we let too many people who are not Christian into our country, then they're going to drag us into Sharia law, or if we get people of the wrong race, then we're completely doomed," and so on. And libertarians haven't been prepared to argue against this outlook. And what's interesting about it is that, so it's extremely important to realize that a century ago, when our existing total states were largely built, that's when we got central banks and wage controls and income taxes, passports and migration restrictions, and heavy corporate regulations, and almost all over the developed world. That this apparatus is built by these two pillars. One was left wing and one was right wing, and they look like their effects are very similar, but they have different pitches. So left socialism appeals to intellectuals and to the highly educated elite populations and that sort of thing, and they reach out to extremely marginalized groups with the advertisement that we're going to get you all that money that the rich people have. We're going to get it to you. It's always a lie, but that's what they always say. The right wing version of the pitch is more of an appeal to the bourgeoisie. You're being displaced by foreigners, foreign countries are coming after you. Your populations are being swamped by people who don't share your values, and they're going to rob you and vote you out of power. You better rally around a strong man right away, to save your nation and your race and your people and your faith. Right. So these are two different
society.
What?
Libertines are degenerating society through the media.
Yeah. Well, you can always spot the right Hegelians by the use of language. Degeneracy is a very interesting word, because etymologically speaking, degeneracy literally means to diminish the quality of the gene pool.
Oh, right, that's it. Interesting.
Yeah.
I never even knew that.
Yeah. So anytime you hear a person going on about the rise of degeneracy, that is a specific, calling on a specific theory of race and and the role of that genes play in the quality of the human civilization. So if you're engaged in degeneracy, what it means is that you've got a dysgenic behavior taking place. Like if you keep this up, then you're going to reduce the quality of the human family that we've gathered in this great nation.
That's the roots of the words. I guess everybody who uses that terminology doesn't always know exactly what the root of that word. I think they just mean there's a general, deterioration in morals and values and so
the
forth.
Quality of art and. But I think
it works both ways. Some people use it. Some people use the word degeneracy and know exactly what they mean. Other people use it naively. Both are true. But libertarians are susceptible to trolling from the right, because they just haven't been well educated. And it's in this alternative history of collectivism. I mean, unfortunately, you can always point to the Nazi experiment, and to the rise of fascism, the interwar period, and World War II, but none of us were there. It seems almost like a fable that we're being told about like every day since early in public school, and it starts to seem like this mythological past, and we get weary of hearing about it, especially from the leftists, because they're always saying, but the fascism and Hitler, and you're just like, well, yeah, that's some bad stuff, but what about communism and Pol Pot and Mao and Stalin?
Come on, Jeffrey, that wasn't real socialism.
Yeah, that's what they say. So it frustrates us, and so we start. They're kind of the worst messengers for the anti-fascist position are the left, because they actually don't have any credibility. So that's why I think libertarians need to be out front on this. Yeah.
Especially since, the left are the ones that are infiltrating the university, or have infiltrated the university, the media, and so forth. And so it's kind of you're kind of going, well, look, I'm not seeing an immediate threat from the right here. They're not shutting down speakers on campuses. But you guys are. But they have been fairly open on the alt-right. Richard Spencer was on a Google Hangout, and someone said, but we don't even believe in free speech, really, do we? And it's like, no, of course not. I mean, we need it now as a tool to advocate for our ideas, but of course we don't. They want to ban prostitution, all substances, pornography, and so forth. And you might not approve of any of those things, but as a liberal or a libertarian-minded person, you respect that people have the right to do this. So my next question...
Could I just ask a brief one? Yeah. What I hear currently from those on what I would say is the more enlightened left, who are trying to make a stand against the encroachment on free speech, I hear them say things like, the left has abandoned free speech. However, it's my assertion that the left never really cared about free speech per se. They only cared about free speech for them, traditionally. Would you agree with that?
I think that has been true since the 1960s.
Right.
So you had a lot of weird things going on the left over the last 40 years. Once it became really obvious that socialism is terrible, so you have to either abandon the ideology and embrace free markets, or you're going to have to like distort the ideology in some way to preserve the ideology but save it from its biggest errors. And that's mostly what the left has done. I mean, this is why it's becoming ever crazier, right? Like all the time.
Because
And
they've run out of arguments.
yeah, they've run out of arguments, but they want to preserve their left Hegelian outlook, their Marxian outlook. So then it just mutates and takes different forms. So suddenly, this attack on cultural appropriation, which I don't know if that's going on in Scotland, but I mean here, if you're doing yoga or eating Mexican food, then you're going to have somebody saying, "Stop appropriating that culture. That's a form of theft, and you're a criminal."
Well, that reminds me.
Crazy.
One of the things I've always loved about your advocacy for liberty is that you've always seemed so cheerful, and what you were known for presenting capitalism as something that enriches our life and gives us this diversity of food, diversity of music. It's all to play for. It's an open bazaar full of all sorts of products and services, more than you can choose between. And that's something that I always felt came through in your advocacy, that the bright side of it, it's not the Dickensian image of a child. It's a counterpoint to the Dickensian image of capitalism, which is a child going up a chimney in a factory or something like that.
Sounds fun to me, but yeah. So that's what's actually interesting about the state in which we find ourselves. That one of the reasons I think both the left and the right have become more and more extreme and crazy is a sense of panic that they're losing control of the world. And thanks to technology and globalization and digital media, where you can hold this podcast, you have as much power as the old broadcasters 40 years ago, and they're panicked, and they're really trying to hold on to try to stop progress, essentially. And that's really the essence of what's always been at the very core of the liberal revolt. They don't want history to move forward according to the choices of individuals. They want to plan things and constrain things and structure things in a way to get rid of this chaos. So both the left and the right are reactionaries. I mean, they're trying to restore a time gone by, and it just takes different forms.
Sure. Is that perhaps the reason? Well, it's my take that why are conservatives so bad at defending capitalism? Why are they so poor at making a case for capitalism? But they are here, at least in the UK.
Yeah, well, there's in the English tradition in UK history, there's always been three main political forces: Labour, representing left socialism, one sort or another; Toryism, which has always been celebrating landowners and hierarchies and rule by the aristocracy; and then the third group, which has been the liberals, who favor small states, free trade, and rights for everybody. And that, I mean, it's incredible. Here we are in the 21st century, and those three things are still alive after all this time. That's 200 years of the same political fight.
Unfortunately, we're just trying to resuscitate the liberal tradition in the UK. We are the foremost knights of liberty on these isles, in Scotland at least.
Sad, isn't it?
It's really, really sad. But we're doing our best.
We've always been a minority, though. That's the interesting thing. Like even when we won great victories like the repeal of the Corn Laws, or the end of slavery, or the advance of women's rights in the 19th century, or the advent of free trade after World War II, or the rise of constitutional government, or whatever, restrictions on power, essentially. It was almost always happened like accidentally. We were always the minority, but we prevailed like a little bit. But every time human beings are given just a little bit of freedom, however accidentally, we go crazy, and we build great cities, and we make great technologies, and just a little bit of freedom makes our lives so much better that I think liberalism is the cause, really, the philosophical foundation of all the things we love, even though we're always kind of like a small minority.
Freedom refuses to die.
Yeah.
So what makes it right, not left? Because you mentioned the horrendous Nazi experiment, and there are to this day, maybe more than ever, people who will go on YouTube and say, no, Hitler was a socialist. He should be put on the left side of this political spectrum. Not the right. I mean, if only the communists and Nazis that were fighting in the streets of Germany in the early 20th century had known that they were both on the left, oh, maybe they could have just all got in bed together. But no, what makes the right the right?
What makes the right the right?
What made National Socialism? Why would you place National Socialism on the right?
Or just fascism in general on the right? Why do you put it in the right?
Well, a lot of it traces to the splits in Hegelianism in the early 20th century. Hegel's view was that the collective is everything and the individual is nothing. So that takes a variety of forms. So left socialism tends to be more internationalist, and they divide society between the workers and the capitalists. Of course, these days the left divides society in a million other additional ways. But the right has always been about the nation and the people as the collective, and it's never really. What's interesting about the right is it says, look, if you put us in power, you can keep your religion, you can keep your property, your family, and you can experience a new form of identity, a collective identity as a people, and you can have all these things provided that they serve the cause of the great collective. So in that way, right Hegelianism does not tend to attack fundamentally people's religion or family or property. It is willing to acquiesce to it, and so for that reason, it's a little more appealing to the middle class, because it's not a fundamental cultural attack on people on who people are, whereas the left is always attacking what it is.
So the left is trying to say, look, this society is wrong. We need to rip it up and start again and replace it with a system that's going to bring us equality and fair distribution of wealth and so forth. Whereas the right says more appeals to people who consider themselves to be of conscience, and they think, do you know what? Things are good the way they were. We don't really need to rip it up and start again. In fact, that's a bad idea. I hate these radicals that are trying to destroy everything. What we need is a strong leader to restore our greatness and take things forward and steward us in some kind of positive, to give us something to live for, that's bigger than ourselves. I'm tired of these people who only think about themselves, these leftists. They should be thinking about, whatever, our greater destiny as
a people.
And I think that appeals to people who find the life. Well, I guess each appeals to people who find life meaningless, but in a different way.
That's right. It's a way to give you a sense of meaning as being part of something larger than yourself. I mean, both the left and the right are doing this. What's interesting is that the right has a very severe critique of commercial society. They don't, and the reason they don't like commercial society is because it's chaotic, and they consider it to be disloyal. Like if you're building an iPhone and you want to have the screens made in China, then the right is there to say, oh, that is a betrayal of our nation. They don't like the merchant class because the merchant class doesn't care anything about borders. And the merchant class is just giving you products and cool things that you want, and they consider the merchant class to be basically traders, race traders, nation traders, and that sort of thing. And in this sense, there's an ancient tradition, like basically Spartan and Roman, where the merchants were always considered like just barely above the slaves, because they weren't willing to serve the great collective, whether the military or the building of the nation state or the celebration of the great leader. I mean, basically, the working class don't care anything about that.
Because crudely put, they only care about making a buck. They don't care about blood or honor or soil or any of that kind of stuff.
That's it.
Yeah. So, but to be fair, those foreigners are taking their jobs. So.
Well,
so I mean,
Trump is in some ways a right Hegelian. I mean, like he keeps invoking these tropes that are from the right Hegelian right-wing collectivist tradition. So he you know, like his attacks on the American companies who are outsourcing their products. You know, like every day he's denouncing like Amazon and Apple. And saying, you know, the traders and the among the media, you know, it's just like a barrage of stuff, and it's kind of interesting because in the U.S. in any case, the Republican Party has usually been in favor of commerce, right, and the commercial classes, but Trump has changed this, you know, completely, and I think it's interesting. I think if you're going to look forward over the next year or two, you're going to see it get ever more intense. You know, this kind of right-wing attack on commercial society.
Because I guess I'm thinking Trump's major problem with some of these corporations like Amazon is that they're transnational and global, as he perceives it, and therefore they have no loyalty again to the nation state. Yeah.
That's right.
Well, I mean, it would be nice if he stopped giving them handouts out of the public purse. You know, that's a good start. I'm sure you can stop some corporate welfare, please, Trump. That might be nice.
Especially if it is large military corporations, you know, that build.
But you know, it's even getting worse than that because many farmers lost their export markets as a result of his trade wars. And so they stopped being able to sell soybeans abroad and things like this. So now Trump has delivered $12 to $14 billion in subsidies to the people who have been hurt by his own policy. That's going on like right now.
It's so infuriating. I'm almost reminded of that story about and this is straight out of Atlas Shrugged. There was a period where the watches made in America took 58 minutes to count an hour, and the Swiss watches were accurate. So rather than allow Americans to import superior watches from Switzerland, the government decided to put a tariff on the accurate Swiss watches, which obviously led to a trade war. And it's like people don't understand the concept of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs, unfortunately, and they don't see that. Yeah, it's a shame for some soybean farmers if they go out of business, but it's time to find themselves a new business, because you can't hold the rest of the country to ransom who want to buy cheaper food. And it's amazing that the left don't see how trade restrictions harm the poorest people in Western countries who can't import cheap goods from abroad because of trade restrictions. And how bad it is, of course, for the third world when we don't send them our money, which they need to build schools and infrastructure and hospitals, because we don't want to put our own farmers or producers out of business out of some nationalistic sentiment. You know, it's the poorest people in the world who really stand to benefit from free trade, and yet both the left and the right seem to think there could be nothing worse than free trade. It's bizarre.
This is exactly what's happening in the US. The left is not objecting to Trump's trade wars, like, at all. I mean, Elizabeth Warren is his biggest enemy, right? Trump's biggest enemy.
Ostensibly,
but she is all for the trade restrictions on China. I mean, she thinks he's entirely correct. Yeah.
I would just, so on this point about free trade, one of our live viewers has asked us, Guerrilla TV channel, ask him about Adam Smith. Nothing more specific than that, but perhaps you could say a little bit about it for.
What did Smith get right and what did Smith get wrong in your view?
Oh, I love Adam Smith. We have to remember that
He didn't have
there've been a lot of
Smith.
That's,
yeah. Well, that's right. I mean, there've been a lot of advances in economics since the time of Smith, of course. But generally, you know, his chapter on the division of labor is absolutely brilliant. His celebration of regular people building good lives through cooperation and trade. I just don't think anybody is like, even now it's beautiful. I also really like The Theory of Moral Sentiments, his first book. It's really interesting to read and really glorious book. So I there's plenty of problems with Smith. Like, I think he acquiesced too easily to the idea of a large public sector, you know, and his labor theory of value, he got that wrong. You know, although in some of his notes and his lectures he got it right. So he wasn't a perfect thinker, and it's really easy to attack him, I guess. But But I think if we wanted to have a founding father of capitalism, a word he never used, I think we could do a lot worse than Adam Smith. I really think benefit from reading him even today. I love The Theory of Moral Sentiments so much, and Wealth of Nations. I mean, you know, he starts off the book by asking a really profound question: how does a society grow wealthier? I mean, it's a really interesting and mysterious thing. Aristotle didn't think it was possible. You know, if you read his section on economics and wealth, he thinks that the way you get wealthy is by taking it from somebody else, right? I mean, he doesn't believe there's such a capacity to make society overall wealthier. I mean,
it's kind of zero-sum game, if you will.
Yeah, entirely. So by the 18th century, it became obvious we had gone through about 150 or 200 years in which you saw people gradually getting wealthier. And it was at the end of the Black Death and the rise of more and more commercial society, once the end of feudalism came and average people started getting money and trading started taking place, and you started seeing, you know, the opening of the factory systems and poor people getting suddenly richer and people creating businesses. And Smith really set out to discover, like, well, it's clear that everybody's getting wealthier. How does this happen? So he was like a scientist to trying to figure this mystery out.
Right.
And his answer is correct, but a little bit boring. He says it's that the rise of wealth is made possible through the expansion of the market and the division of labor. Like, to the extent that you can more peacefully cooperate with other people, that allows you to specialize more, and for them to specialize more, and for us all together through trade and exchange to create this thing we call wealth. And it's a great answer. And I think he might have been the most prominent intellectual, the first most prominent intellectual in the world to really identify this as the source of wealth creation.
And of course, he came from here in Scotland, so can't be that bad.
Yeah.
Well, I would add that it's quite amazing how Trump has managed to debunk his arguments, and also David Ricardo's and all the classic. I mean, for someone who's just you know, come up in business in New York to 250 years later smash the arguments of the neoclassical economists, I mean, he sure showed Adam Smith, didn't he?
Indeed.
It's very frustrating because he has just a handful of arguments, you know, Trump, and he keeps saying them over and over again. One is that it's never in the
best propaganda techniques.
Yeah, it is. It is. He says it's never in a country's interest for business domiciled in the nation to ever have production taking place outside the borders. He says it's never in a country's interest to ever let that happen. That's always bad. So he doesn't understand that actually you know, the money comes back, the products come back, and they're cheaper and they're more available to everybody, and the more you can draw. It's like Adam Smith said, like, if you can have a bigger range of the division of labor, then everybody gets wealthier together. He doesn't get that. The other thing he doesn't understand, maybe, is that the trade deficit figures don't mean anything. They're just accounting fictions. And he always acts like if we're if we're importing more from a country than we're exporting to that country, then that somehow it means that they owe us something,
Right.
and that they're robbing us. So until the trade figures are either equal or a surplus between the US and every other country, or every country and every other country, he thinks there's something unfair taking place.
And it's really quite crazy when you think about it, because does my standard of living increase when I buy something or when I sell something? It's when I get stuff that I become richer. So I want to import things. If I'm a nation, I want to make as many exchanges as possible so I get stuff that makes me happy. So it's a very crazy point of view. Trump, read your David Ricardo. Okay.
Well, and then he's becoming ever more extreme, you know, and basically he imagines himself to be the CEO of every company,
right,
in America, and he thinks that he personally can run all these companies better than the companies themselves. I mean, he's lecturing Apple on where their production should take place, and it's like, you don't have any skin in this game. You know, this is not your company. You don't know anything about this subject. But he's kind of like Mussolini in a way. Like, he really thinks that he can plan the economy out of his own brain. It's really something.
Well, one of the questions I've got to ask this: is that a ready-made bow tie, or or do you tie the bow tie yourself? And does Murray Rothbard, does his estate get any commission for every time a libertarian wears a bow tie?
It is a bow tie to tie, and I
excellent. Only cads and bounders wear ready-made bow ties. Right. I am both a cad and a bounder, but I see no reason to advertise the fact by wearing a ready-made bow tie. So well done.
Thank you. I'm traveling right now. I'm in Great Barrington at the American Institute for Economic Research, and so I always take a big pile of bow ties with me. And so. But I have about maybe 100, 150 of them at home or something like this. I have 2 of Murray's bow ties that his wife gave to me after Murray died. And it's funny because I've been wearing a bow tie many, many years before I ever met Murray. I started wearing a bow tie when I was about 15 years old. Although my mother shows me pictures of me when I was like 2 years old, 3 years old, and I was always wearing a bow tie. So maybe I always loved them. I don't know. I asked her the other day, I said, did I demand this, or you just put them on me? She goes, I think you like the bow ties.
I think every man should. It's one of those things every man should be able to do in his life, is tie a bow tie. So I think you should possibly do a video on YouTube showing all libertarians how the proper method of tying a bow tie.
Yeah, I wondered about that. It's funny that you mentioned this, because even this morning, because this is also a detachable collar. Which are extremely difficult to put on. So there's a huge apparatus associated with it. So you attach the collar, you flip it up, you put the thing out, you have to reshape the collar and lock it.
It doesn't go ping with comedic effect at any moment.
Does it roll around in a circle?
But it takes time to learn to put on this thing. And I was actually thinking this morning it would be someday fun to do a video just explaining precisely how to do it, because it's years of experience. I can do it without a mirror and just very, very quickly, but it does take some dexterity. Yeah.
Your signature look. So recently you had an article out about economic autarky. For those of us who are woefully naive, what does that mean, and why should we know about it?
Yeah, autarky, AUTARKY, and it was the theory that emerged out of initially from Germany, out of Friedrich List, and it was a repudiation of Adam Smith's theory of free trade. The idea is that all production should take place within a geographically constrained unit, and that's what national policy should strive towards, is like complete barriers, you know. And what's fascinating about that whole theory is that it didn't really go anywhere in the 19th century, but it really started to take hold in the 20th century. And in the US anyway, we had, we were repealing tariffs, and getting ever more free trade. And then the Great Depression hit. And immediately it was like, okay, here's our new tariff walls in 1930. And my article yesterday on autarky actually examined a really interesting article by John Maynard Keynes, who wrote it in 1933. Now, Keynes had previously been a champion of free trade and somewhat liberal in his outlook in the Economic Consequences of the Peace, which came out, I think, in 1919, more of a liberal. But in 1933, he announces that now, basically, he's an autarkist, right? So he says that everything should be homespun. I can't believe he used that word. I mean, like, I'm supposed to sit at home with a spinning wheel? I mean, this is, instead of buying a t-shirt from China, I'm supposed to like sit at home with it's a crazy word. But then he even says something more absurd. He says, all finance should be national. Okay, so what that would mean is, I don't know what, it means that like you couldn't buy a US Treasury bill, you know? Or that I wouldn't be able to trade in the Japanese stock market, or that I wouldn't be able to have any money at a Swiss bank account, or that world stock market shouldn't be integrated in any sense. The bond market should only be nation by nation.
Controls, basically.
Yeah, I mean, that would be like, I mean, it's just incredible to say all finance has to be national. So what I did in this article was like deconstruct his article and say, well, why did he favor this? And the reason he favored it is that Keynes had become a champion of central planning, right? So he says in 1933, he's like, a lot of countries are getting it right, like Russia, Germany, Italy, and Ireland. Now, I don't know what was going on in Ireland in 1933. I don't know what was going on in Ireland in 1933. But in Russia, the Ukrainian famine was going on, and 6 to 7 million people died of starvation or actively killed by Stalin. Stalin had been in control since 1929. So here you have John Maynard Keynes going, there's really good things going on in Russia. In Germany, the Nazis had almost taken full control of the country, and 2 years later had imposed the Nuremberg laws that specifically deprecated Jews as citizens, and had laws against employing them. Mises escaped from Austria in 1934 because he saw what was happening. And in Italy, Mussolini was firmly in charge of the government and was implementing the corporate state. So here you have John Maynard Keynes saying, there's a lot of very good stuff going on in the world in places like Italy, Germany, and Russia. And there may make some mistakes, but mostly this is very good. And every country should adopt this. But in order to adopt it, they have to have autarky. They have to become little experiments. Every nation should be an experiment in central planning that's completely self-contained, ruled by dictators and advised by very smart people like John Maynard Keynes. I mean, so that was the basis of his theory of autarky. So, and so then
what does it have in common with technocracy? Is it similar then?
Well, autarky makes possible technocracy. So first, you have to constrain the trade. Like, you have to make society a laboratory as a controlled experiment, and that means you have to stop this crazy activity of everybody trading outside the country. So autarky is like, as far as Keynes was concerned, was an essential condition for central planning. Like, you had to first eliminate international trade. Then you could start conducting all kinds of experiments. So autarky becomes like an important precondition for every kind of dictatorial central planning regime. Well, I think it's a really interesting thing. I mean, autarky goes like this: Adam Smith, autarky. Okay, these are the opposite points of view. And they've always been opposed to each other. Now, so I think Trump is basically an autarkist, but I think people have been very slow to realize this. Like, they didn't believe him, you know, because we're so unfamiliar with this. It's so weird. Like, since World War II, the autarkist position has been completely rejected. Like, first we had the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and you can look at a chart of tariff barriers since World War II and just see they're going down, 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 down. And then we had the World Trade Organization, it was down, down, and everybody agreed, okay, free trade is an essential condition for prosperity and peace. All right, like This was a consensus believed all over the world. Now here we are in the 21st century, and people are like, man, I'm not so sure about that. So it's changing, and it's weird. Like the one thing that we got right.
It's creepy now, whereas before it seemed like a good idea. I mean, it was compelling, the idea, like you said. I mean, you're just going to let the economy do its own thing. No central planning, no plan. Look at the stupid decisions you can see people make. I mean, that guy's fat over there and he's eating a burger, right? Well, these people can't be trusted. We need to have sensible people to look at the science, to look at the data, and make a plan. Obviously, like you can't just. Otherwise, it's stupid. I think that's a prevalent view. Still, I think it was more prevalent. It was prevalent in the period that you were discussing, but now it's seen as a little bit more creepy, maybe.
Maybe. And I don't know. I mean, I'm a little cautious to be the guy who says, oh, these people don't matter. But mainly because in the late 19th century, people of our views were convinced that the future was ours. I mean, we thought that, like, between about 1850 and about 1890, the world had transformed. You know, I mean, lives were getting longer and longer. Population was dramatically rising. Cities were growing tall up in the air thanks to the commercialization of steel. We got flight, internal combustion, new communication technologies with telephones. Everything was photography was advancing. I mean, it was amazing. And you looked at it, and people like with our views said, "Oh, look, finally the world's getting its act together. You know, we're leaving feudalism. We understand that commerce is glorious. It's making everybody rich. We need to protect private property and keep government small." And they thought that everything would be fine. And then, like almost in a blink of an eye, you know, like right after the turn of the 20th, as we're moving into the 20th century. It all started happening at once, you know, central banking, income taxes, and then labor controls and regulations and segregations and passports. Well, that came along with the terrible, terrible, terrible thing, World War I. I mean, World War I was really the turning point, because that massively empowered governments all in every country that was at war, and production was nationalized. We got passports and migration restrictions, and central banks funded, made possible World War I. And then after that, it was like we've had a hell of a time just getting rid of these states that were built in this period. So as you march forward in the 20th century, like after the collapse of communism, and the rise of digital technology, we started seeing states diminish more and more in power, and more private companies getting richer, and standard of living rising, and it's looking really good. And I think libertarians might look at that and say, "Oh, we're going to win," and I think we are. But I'm just a little cautious about it, because I know what happened a century ago when we got overconfident. You know, we had terrible things hit the world, and I think this is why we have to be out there fighting, you know, every day for liberalism, classically understood, because our voices need to be there to counter, you know, the prominent voices on the left and the right, and the media, the left and right media, and the left wing. Clerisy and the universities, and then government that always wants to hang on to its power, and that leaves just us to say, well, here's an even better idea. Why don't we just everybody be left alone to live their lives, you know?
So what's more important in your view, or are they equal? Do they need to go hand in hand? Is economic liberty more important? Is that a prerequisite? Is that more important than actual civil liberties to start with, or do they go hand in hand?
They're absolutely inseparable, and it's frustrating because you talk to the left and they can agree with you on civil liberties, maybe less so now than used to, but but used to they would agree with us on civil liberties, but then they would say, oh, but not economic liberty. But actually, if you go back to the work of Benjamin Constant, 1820, he was a great, I think Benjamin Constant, I think he was French. But he wrote this great essay called "The Difference Between the Liberty of the Ancients and the Liberty of the Moderns." And he said that at the end of the Middle Ages, this new conception of liberty came to the world, where everyone had equal freedom and the right to get rich and live a good life. But essential to that new conception, that modern conception of liberty, was commercial freedom. Like you can't even speak about freedom unless you're willing to grant the centrality and the need of commercial freedom. So I mean, I think it's our job to be celebrators of commerce. So and the left disagrees with that, and increasingly the right does too. So it just kind of leaves us. So I think it's absolutely essential that we talk about it, about economics in every possible way. And I love economics as a discipline, as a science, as a subject, you know. But we need to figure out ways to communicate this with people in every possible way. Like if you don't have the freedom to own and to trade and to create, and to take a job on your own terms and things like this, you're really not free.
Right, I could not agree more. And on the point of being out up front to refute the other voices, there are many, we are few, but we do have the truth on our side. And sometimes, well, I hope that will go a long way. So I mean to change tack a little bit. We had a couple of questions from fans, and we did say we talked a little bit about libertarian infighting or splits within the libertarian movement. So someone wanted basically you to explain why you're no longer affiliated with the Mises Institute.
Well, I was at the Mises Institute for 25 years, and really was there to build the whole thing. And I was the webmaster and posted 1,000 books. I'm very proud of my work there. I knew for sure by 2011 or so that I did not want this job for life, and I wanted different kinds of challenges. And so I took immediately a job with a for-profit company called Agora Financial, and an opportunity to rebuild laissez-faire books. And I was just looking for new challenges. That was essentially it. And I think it was a really good decision. I'm very proud of the work I did at the Mises Institute, and very happy about all the work I did there and the people I met, and all my friends and colleagues. But I think I didn't believe anybody who told me that it was somehow my job, my obligation to stay in one institution my entire life. I mean,
yeah, right, of course not.
Yeah.
So I mean, are relations between you and Mises cordial or cordial?
What? One more time? I'm sorry.
Are relations between yourself and the Mises Institute, are they perfectly cordial then?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of friends who continue to speak there and that sort of thing. So I have no interest in feeding, there's a lot of people on the outside who look in and go, oh, look, this person likes this person, that person doesn't like that person, and so on and so on. And I just think that's just a huge waste of time. Like for me personally, there aren't enough of us, to justify that sort of thing. And I get really tired of libertarian infighting, because I think what happens is that people start to get bored. Like they feel like they're not making any difference in the world, And so then they decide the only people who really care about what they're saying are other libertarians. And so social media has fed this, so there's every day there's fights online, and there's Twitter wars and the gossiping and groups, and you probably have noticed this, but I never participate in any of this stuff at all. I'd rather write in a bigger way towards bigger subjects, and not to get dragged down and that kind of.
Well, I'm not on Twitter or Facebook. I'm happily clueless of what's going on there, unless he tells me.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, there's a perception that an article that you wrote, which, by the way, we discussed. I'm not sure if we discussed it on our show, but we definitely discussed it over a beer, which was the brutalist versus humanist. Now, personally, when I didn't know the context of this article, or that it created a controversy, I personally found it a useful metric, because I could identify the two different strands, the more Oh, liberty capitalism is so good because it enriches humanity versus me and my stuff. You know, get off my land. Now,
Right.
actually, both are valid arguments for liberty. I mean, you don't have the right to my stuff, but I believe, since becoming a libertarian, especially as someone that came over from the left, that if we're going to win the war of minds, we have to make the humanitarian case for capitalism, because not everyone's going to share our values, and we need to show the humanitarian face of capitalism to bait people's appetite. And if they can see that this isn't a system that exploits people, that it does raise people's standards of living, they'll come to see the sense of the principle, the non-aggression principle. But it was the utilitarian. I needed to be satisfied that the poor weren't going to be dying on the streets before embracing the non-aggression principle and becoming an anarchist. So I personally found it a useful metric. Do you want to speak a little bit about the controversy that article created and why you think that is?
Sure. I wrote that. First of all, I love that article. I think it took me a long time to think through. I had noticed that certain people who might otherwise be friends of libertarianism were suspicious of us because they thought that we wanted our own kind of plan or our own set of power, and that it was just purely about my right to do shitty things, and so I began to wonder, are libertarians actually playing into that? Are we saying things, and have we developed attitudes that are losing a broader sense of the aesthetic of human liberty to only focus on a really stripped down, narrow perspective? So I wrote the article, and this brutalism word grew out of an architectural analogy. And I don't want to go into it because you can read the article, but there's a form of architecture that emerged after World War II. Like, people said, okay, well, if you're going to bomb our buildings, then we're just going to make them purely functional, and without any adornments, not making them very beautiful. So my concern was that we would construct a libertarianism that looked very much like brutalist architecture, just extremely minimalist with no broader vision, which, I mean, I knew Murray well. Murray had a big vision of the world.
Right.
Mises had a big vision. Hayek had a big vision. Bastiat, I mean, Benjamin Constant. Every great libertarian thinker has had a big vision of the world. And
Rand, arguably more on the brutalist camp, had a big, exciting vision of what capitalism meant.
So my article was really an attempt to kind of tease out these two kind of perspectives, one purely stripped down and reductionist, and the other big and evocative. And I was excited about the article just as a purely intellectual exercise. I was excited about it because I thought I made a really interesting, a very interesting argument. So, but when I posted it, I was shocked because it just blew up. And it was a raging controversy for like 6 months or even a year. And I didn't entirely understand where it came from. And I didn't respond to any of the critics because I felt like people were reading things into it that really weren't there. Like one of the things people really wanted to know was, who was I attacking? And I could just honestly say I wasn't attacking anyone in particular. I was attacking like a body of conceptual ideas that may or might, like a way of thinking, that maybe nobody actually holds that view, but if you overly reduce libertarianism to just the most stripped down possible position, it could result in this, if you forget the bigger vision. So for me, it was an intellectual exercise. So, but I think everybody thought I was throwing myself into this debate. And I already told you, I don't really get involved with the factional disputes. But what people were telling me is you don't understand. This debate between left and right libertarianism or something like that has been raging, for 2 years. And I was like, yeah, I think I know about that a little bit, but I wasn't all that tuned into it. So I inadvertently entered into this huge fight and didn't entirely know that that's what I was doing. And so I made this gigantic contribution, and it was, and suddenly everybody was pulling at me. But like I said, I didn't really respond to it because I wrote my article, and that's really kind of all I wanted to say about it, really. And I didn't mean to divide people more. I was just trying to provoke a thought. And what was interesting about it, it actually made me laugh, is that like that article created, temporarily anyway, a brutalist movement. Because I gave the cool name to the bad guys and the lame name to the good guys. And so the bad guys are like, oh yeah, I'm a brutalist. So suddenly there's all these brutalist groups on Facebook.
I liked it. It seems to be synonymous with misanthrope.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah. Well, I'm the humanist on this show, and Tom's the brutalist for his.
That's great. Well, I think
between us there's some sort of balance there.
Well, there's a little bit of brutalism in all of us. It's okay.
I've become increasingly misanthropic, and I don't know if it's spending too much time around this guy, or I'm just more in tune to how far gone the world actually is, and how annoying people are.
But you know, that article's been translated into many, many languages, and it keeps being read. And I reread it every once in a while. There's certain things about it I might change, but mostly I think it's a really interesting article. By the way, I write to explain things to myself.
Yes, so familiar.
This is how I think out loud, right? And a lot of times I'm explaining things to myself and discovering things for myself. It's like, for me, it's an adventure. So that article was a little bit of a corrective to me personally. It's like, here's where I might go with my thinking if I get carried away in just one path. And so here's my way of working myself out of that to understanding the bigger picture. And it really was, so I wasn't lecturing people. It was more like, to help me understand myself.
Yeah. I don't want to push the issue or anything like that, so feel free to dismiss the question, but there's a perception that you lost some friends over that article. Is that, do you hold that as accurate?
Oh, sure. Certainly. I mean, I've lost friends over any big articles I've written. I mean, I lost a friend. Well, I mean, I don't. To me, I wish that people could be friends, even if they disagree. But like when I first started writing about cryptocurrency, for example, I mean, I had a lot of people just like say, "Oh, this guy's crazy." That article led to some loss of friendship. I mean, I think my old friend Hans Hoppe, you know, I have some disagreements with him, but I also published a lot of his work. Has variously called me, you know, a foe.
I know, it's a shame. My friend turned foe, Jeffrey Tucker.
But doesn't he mean simply an intellectual foe, or the same way you would describe someone in a boxing match, or, you know, as your? I
don't know.
Who would win in a boxing match, you or Hans Hermann Hoppe?
Let's get it on.
Yeah, right. Well, the other thing is that Hans has really, I don't know, it's hard. Hans is a hard one to figure out, but he also, in that same speech, really made fun of liberalism. He called it like wimpy and, you know, irrelevant. I don't know how you can be a libertarian and not have a profound respect and appreciation for the liberal tradition. So I'm not sure where he's headed with his thinking there. And I worry about a libertarianism that's detached from the liberal tradition, because I'm afraid it gets unmoored and very confused. And ideology can be very dangerous, you know? Like you look at a guy like Werner Sombart, you know, whom Hayek writes about in Road to Serfdom. Here's a guy who was obviously very brilliant, but he was a dedicated communist, right, for decades, and wrote all these books on communism, blah, blah, blah. Very smart guy. And then lost his faith in communism and went through a brief period of like social democracy or something like that. And then the Nazis came along, and then he went full Nazi. And then he started writing all these books in favor of national socialism and the Nazi Party. And I look at a life like that, and it seems like such a waste, you know. And I think we have to be really careful with the way we play with ideas, and we need to root ourselves in something. Like we need to be careful, otherwise our minds will just run crazy. And this is why I like emphasizing liberal tradition. Like we have a long lineage tracing back to the late Middle Ages, really, and our views were built up carefully, a little bit at a time, with religious liberty and free speech and freedom of press and limits on power. And we began to develop technologies a little bit at a time to keep government at bay. And then we started getting new theoretical developments in economics, and so on and so on. And then always part of the liberal tradition, by the way, has always been the anarchist position, which is that, look, there's nothing the state knows how to do well. Society's better at everything than the state. The state can't add anything to what we're trying to do here on this planet. And that's always been part of the liberal tradition. So I don't think that because, if you've embraced an anarchism, that separates you from liberalism. I mean, Gustave de Molinari was believed in the private production of security in the 19th century. A guy like Juan de Mariana, the late Middle Ages Spanish scholastic, believed that the states are dispensable institutions, and that we could just get rid of them. So anarchism is also part of the liberal tradition. I think there's something wrong if we detach ourselves from that. I think it's actually potentially really dangerous.
Right, and I have benefited from some of Hans Hermann Hoppe's thinking, but my main problem with Hoppeanism, well, I've got two. One is, first of all, I would be thrown out of Hans Hermann Hoppe's, physically removed from his gated community for being too much of a cad. And secondly, I wouldn't want to be a member of a gated community that would have me as a member.
That's really funny. I mean, there's a way in which you can defend Hans's position on physical removal, just simply to say, like, if you had a polycentric legal order, then every small community can have its own rules, and that's certainly true. But to pretend as an intellectual that you know what those rules would be, and which ones would succeed and which ones would fail, I think that is something you can't know. You have to have a market working.
That's the wonder of the market. Ideas get tried, and the good ones win out over time and get rolled out.
Yeah, and so and this is where I think Hayek can make a good correction, because I mean, like, Hayek believed that the rules that order our lives should also be subject to a kind of a market test. And this is a position that I think has been elaborated on in really great ways by people like David Friedman and so on. And I think this is a more correct way to understand things, rather than thinking that as libertarians we know for sure what all the rules in society should be. I mean, it's just too much.
I mean, that's not a libertarian principle.
I think so.
Well, we have been going for a little over an hour, but if you would be willing to, I've got one or two more questions for you before we wrap up, and you can spend as much or as little time as you'd like. And they are from our listeners, which is why I'd like the opportunity to ask you them. The first is, someone wanted to know a little bit about your conversion from Southern Baptism to Catholicism, if it isn't too personal a question.
It's always difficult to deconstruct something like that, and every time I answer it, the answer is a little bit different. Sometimes we don't always know what goes into it, but I mean, I think for me, like, once I wanted to take.
How are you? Is it a philosophical position, or are you practice?
Well, I think when I made that choice, it was because I wanted to get serious about thinking about the relationship between religion, society, and my own personal commitments, and I found Catholicism to be much more rich and interesting world to explore, than this really truncated. I think what struck me at the time was, very simple Southern Baptist religion. I also liked that Catholicism was really connected to history, so I could examine the history of the Catholic Church and also see the rise of things like the university, beautiful music and architecture and the relationship between religious liturgy and the development of social norms and so and if you know something about the way this works, it's like when you get really super interested in something like this and you can't stop thinking about it, eventually you just go, you know, I'm going to stop fighting. I'm just going to join it, you know. So it took me like 3 or 4 years. But yeah, I eventually just said.
The thing is that I jumped the other way. I was born and raised pretty much strict Roman Catholic. I embraced, for want of a better word, what you might call an evangelical Protestant tradition, and it baffles me. I can't even begin to understand why somebody would go the other way. I mean, just a couple of things, and you're free to refute them. I mean, Roman Catholic Church opposed Belgian Constitution, opposed the French Constitution, it opposed, I believe, even the American Constitution, and sought very keenly and violently to try and keep control of absolute monarchies, which, of course, it could influence. It would seem to be the absolute enemy of free-thinking liberalism, but I mean, perhaps you have some other take on that.
I can't disagree with what you just said. I think there's many particular ways in which the Catholic Church has been a force for centralization, an opponent of liberalism. Even as late as the 1880s and 1890s, the Catholic Church was fighting against religious liberty and fighting for acquiescence to power. And these issues are extremely complicated, and there's nobody who can win this debate. But one thing about Catholicism, well, one thing you can say about that is that the Catholic Church, though, as a multinational power, has been a little bit of a check against nationalism. So this is one of the problems that came with the Protestant Reformation, right? So suddenly you had a German state church, you had a Swiss state church, and the Puritans were quite totalitarian and tribal. Catholicism is not very tribal because it's so universal and inclusive of so many, from Africa to Asia to Central America. So there's a universalism that tends to be a check against nationalism. So I don't disagree with anything you said, actually, at all. But there's also another weight there too. The Catholicism has been, and actually, it's interesting because even in the 16th century, or actually you can go back further to the late 15th century, and see that the Catholic Church was, in many ways, a protector and defender of the multinational merchant class throughout Europe, and was against the rise of nationalisms and tribalisms and fanaticisms at the local level that would have thrown the Medicis out of Florence, you know, or given rise to some demagogic power in Munster, Germany, or some nonsense like this. Like, the Pope has always been kind of against that kind of fanaticism, and sometimes used violence to prevent it, right? So there's two things. So the Catholic Church, I think, was in many ways a very good influence in that respect, and in other ways a very bad influence, right? I mean, so the Catholic Church blessed the worst form of colonialism and imperialism and violations of human rights and and national constitutions, where the Catholic Church has always been against that, and that's terrible. So history is complicated. And I'll tell you something else. I think it's probably mostly a mistake to choose your religion based on your perceptions of politics. It's not irrelevant, but
that's not why it happened to me. But I get it. Yeah.
Well, as a godless heathen, I don't know a Southern Baptist from a Northern Catholic, so you guys can.
We'll do that another time. Yeah.
Jeffrey, I've enjoyed our conversation so much. We had a couple more questions, but that's all the more reason to have you back 6 months, 9 months, a year down the line. It would be our pleasure.
I can just say, if you have any interest in the subject, we're planning to have a show, hopefully next week, on the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, why it was largely ignored by the West then, and why it was, especially by dissidents in the West who had a lot to say about Vietnam, and why the recent 50-year anniversary of the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia last month received very little publicity. So we hope to tackle that one. So
I'll tune in. Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed visiting with both of you. It means a lot to me.
Thank you. It's been excellent. Thank you very much.
Likewise.
Okay,
Take
all the
care
best.
now.